Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 113. Today's questions are taken from the guide to the Leon class, that's guide 179, and What Went Wrong in Norway, the Wednesday special for that week. Connor McLernan asks, assuming you're able to get production to be reliable, how accurate could the Littorios be with good shells? So I have kind of mentioned this in other discussions on the Drydock about the accuracy of the Littorio class's guns and shells, so I won't go into massive depth here, but basically vary, with the caveat that, of course, the Italian ships, for the most part of their combat history in World War II, didn't carry radar, so there's not going to be a radar-guided fire control system, unless, of course, they somehow get refitted and get put back in use on the Allied side, since for some reason. But in a standard daylight engagement, if they'd had decent quality control on their shell and charge production, they would have been scarily accurate. And the reason I say that is that when you look at the actual combat performance in various battles, the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto proved generally to be very capable of getting straddles, i.e. that is where shells are landing both in front of and behind the target ship, very, very quickly. And that means they've got the range very, very quickly. In some cases, by Royal Navy accounts, they were even getting first or second salvo straddles. In one particular battle, one of the cruiser captains talks about Vittorio Veneto showing up over the horizon. In comes a broadside, they see the gun flashes, so this is the first salvo that's sent out. The next thing they know, there's shell splashes landing all around their ships. And to be fair, if you've watched the episode on plotting and fire control, with the sheer number of rangefinders the Italians stuck on the Littorios, it's not entirely surprising that they were able to get the range very accurately and very fast. So if they could match that with well, not so much a gun, because there wasn't anything particularly wrong with a gun, it's more the shells and charges, but if they could match that with ammunition that actually shot straight, that could have had a very, very significant impact on the battles in the Mediterranean. When you look at just how many photos there are of various Royal Navy ships, especially cruisers, hopelessly outranged by the Italian battleships, but merrily sailing through salvos that have a spread of, in some cases, over a kilometre, which is just awful. But now imagine those spreads are 300 or so metres, which is probably about right for a ship of that range with decent ammo. And all of a sudden, the Royal Navy is going to be short a lot of cruisers, and possibly one or two battleships, because once the cruiser screen's gone, there's no reason that the Littorios can't move in for them. Stephen Lee asks, what are your thoughts on whether quantity of guns, like on Leon, or calibre of guns, like Nagato, is preferable for a battleship? There are quite a lot of factors involved in making that decision. One of the simplest ones is, well, hitting harder is better, and obviously there will be restrictions unless you build your battleship on an absolutely massive scale. There'll be restrictions on the number of guns you can get compared to smaller caliber ones, but how does that affect your broadside weight? So one of the more famous examples is, say, Iron Duke with its 10 13.5 inch guns versus Queen Elizabeth with its 8 15 inch guns, but Queen Elizabeth's broadside was still heavier, thanks to that wonderful mathematical rule that means a slight increase to linear dimensions, like say from 13.5 to 15 inch, actually has a very significant increase in your overall volume. Now, of course, that is 10 guns to 8 guns as opposed to 16 guns versus 8 guns, which would be the comparison between Leon and Nagato, where the Leon actually has a broadside weight that's just over 1,000 pounds more than the Nagato, although you can see the effect of that square cube rule in the fact that it takes double the number of guns and you're only maybe getting 5% more broadside weight. But to my mind, you really want to be comparing three things as your primary deciding factors. One is range. So is your smaller gun going to be at a range disadvantage such that it's going to manifestly affect your ability to perform in battle? Now, that is a rather important qualification, because let's say you're looking at the upper end of things, say 16 versus 18 inch guns. Realistically, any decent 16 inch gun, and World War One or World War Two is going to have a range that goes far beyond the range that you can effectively and accurately shoot it. And an 18-inch gun is just going to go even further beyond that. So at that point, the range doesn't actually matter too much because both sides have a gun capable of engaging at an effective battle range. However, obviously with smaller guns, that may be a problem. So that's issue one. Issue two is how much damage is each hit going to cause? Now, because of that increase in volume that you get with larger guns, you're going to theoretically have exponentially more explosive aboard a larger shell, which means, of course, any single hit will do considerably more damage. And considering how rare battleship gun hits actually are when you compare them to the number of shells fired, you want every single shot to count for as much as possible. However, there is the caveat to that due to various differences in various nations' design philosophies when it comes to these battleship shells, that doesn't strictly scale linearly across different nations. For example, one of the points of comparison I always used to illustrate this point is that the 14 and 15-inch guns of the Royal Navy on the King George V's and the Queen Elizabeth's actually had more explosive firepower than a 16-inch 50 caliber guns shell from, say, an Iowa-class battleship. I.e., this means that when the shell actually arrives inside a target, it's going to hurt a lot more if you get hit by a British 15-inch shell than an American 16-inch super heavy shell, weirdly enough. But that is all affected by the third factor, which is, to be honest, probably the most important, which is armor penetration. Because it doesn't matter if your shell has massively large amounts of explosive if it never actually gets inside. This is why battleships stopped flinging high explosives at each other. High explosive shells, that should be. So when you're looking at the armor penetration, again, it's not an absolute. Because, again, using the 16-inch 50 gun and the Japanese 18-inch gun as a good comparison, both sides' guns are capable of punching through practically any armor they're going to come across at reasonable battle ranges. Now, when you're talking about something that's ridiculously heavily armored like Yamato, and you're talking about the upper end, so sort of the mid to high 20,000s of yards, with a 16-inch shell, then there's a slight margin, but generally speaking, they're pretty much effective against each other at any practical battle range. But this generally will be a factor as you move further down the scale in terms of guns. So looking back at Nagato versus Lyon, what I would do is take a look at the armor penetration capabilities of both guns and then work out, at a reasonable and practical battle range, can my more numerous smaller guns still have a decent shot at penetrating anything that really matters on the enemy ship's armor? If so, then I think unless there's a massive difference between the smaller and larger shells in terms of bursting charge or range, it's probably best to go with more numerous smaller guns, because the more numerous smaller guns statistically are just going to have a greater chance to hit. They take the Lyon versus Nagato. If you fire 16 guns, you have 16 chances to hit. You fire 8 guns, you have 8 chances to hit. And as we said, battleship hits are relatively rare, so you're putting yourself in a much better place. Now, obviously, if your armor penetration is not capable of reliably penetrating the target vessel at a reasonable battle range, and the enemy vessel is going to come at you with larger guns, the chances are, unless you've built a floating brick, that the enemy will be able to penetrate your armor at a range where you can't. So in that case, it would be more practical to build a ship with fewer, heavier guns. So hopefully you can see from that there is no one clear, easy answer. There are a number of factors you have to take into account, but once you've taken them into account, I think that will then provide a fairly clear steer on whether you want more numerous small guns or fewer larger weapons. Jan Witz asks, why, once rearmament had started, did we continue scrapping perfectly serviceable C-class cruisers? There are a few factors involved, one of which is that the C-class, generally most of the ones that were scrapped were actually scrapped before rearmament started, and of the ones that were scrapped 1934 through 1936, the bulk of those were scrapped in the earlier part of that 3-year bracket when rearmament was only just about getting off the ground. Once rearmament was in full swing, so post sort of mid-1936, you didn't see any further C-class scrappings. As you mentioned in the rest of your question, they were actually turned into anti-aircraft cruisers gradually, well, most of them anyway. Now, there were a couple of other factors that bear into this particular decision. One of which is the fact that the C-class that was scrapped were the older ones. Now, while you overall have the C-class as a general group of cruisers, when you look into it, there are multiple subclasses, and over time those subclasses do get slightly faster, slightly larger, slightly heavier, and significantly more heavily armed. So a C-class from the very beginning of the construction run, as compared to a C-class from the end of the construction run. So if you look at, say, something like, ironically enough, HMS Caroline, even though she's the one that's got preserved, versus something from the end of the production run like HMS Cape Town, their capabilities are actually quite different, and the older ones would not have been anywhere close to as capable as the newer ones. So there is a little bit of a capability gap there, but especially when it comes to things like armament. The later ones were built with a main armament of pure 6-inch weapons, which lent themselves fairly well to conversion to anti-aircraft cruisers with single or twin 4-inch weapons, or if you wanted to keep them with the 6-inch guns, then at least they were pretty good at commerce protection against merchant raiders, which is another thing that you mentioned in your question. Whereas the earlier ships that had sort of couple of 6-inch guns and mostly 4-inch guns, their mounting plates for those smaller weapons were, of course, smaller and lighter, and therefore not as suited for conversion work. And also, when you consider some of the armament that was carried on things like Cormoran, not necessarily saying that they would lose, but something that's armed with fewer of the sort of 5.9 6-inch caliber weapons, as opposed to a particularly heavily armed merchant raider, there's not necessarily the kind of ship you would want to have on those kind of protection duties, especially since you then face a really horrible decision of, do we take out the 4-inch weapons, which will give us a numerical gun advantage, and switch them for AA weapons, or do we keep them, in which case you can probably make an argument for an original flavour C-class still being much, much more capable than something like the Cormoran, but then it's incapable of defending itself against air attack. Obviously, there are factors like fire control systems and protection that factor into the cruiser's favour, but it's still a lot closer than even something like a Leander or Arethusa. The other issue is that a lot of the earlier C-class were just worn out. They would have needed quite significant refits and overhauls in order to make them serviceable again. The sort of first probably half to 2/3 of them either saw service throughout the First World War or through the bulk of the First World War. So they had a lot of hard steaming, and that in turn means wear on the machinery. And then by the mid-1930s, they're now getting on for 20 years old. And as we've mentioned in other dry docks about other ships, if you're looking at a ship that's been running for about 20 years and has also had a fair bit of wartime steaming at the beginning of its lifespan, the machinery is basically reaching the end of its life, which means that in order to keep those older ships in service, even if you took into account the various problems mentioned earlier, you would have to haul them in for a full-on overhaul and refit, which would be very expensive for a ship that has relatively minimal value and would take up valuable dockyard space, which you could use to build something like a Dido, an Arethusa, a Leander, if you're looking at kind of like-for-like replacement, or indeed something like a Town, if you wanted to go a bit bigger and nastier. And whilst rearmament was ongoing, the Royal Navy did not have unlimited money, nor did it have unlimited dockyard space. So if you could sell an old C-class and use some of that money to help fund a new Dido class, for example, that was considered a much better trade-off. There is also one other factor, which is crew, because again, you don't have unlimited money, you don't have unlimited trained crews. If you are crash building a brand new fleet of Arethusas, Leanders, Towns, Didos, etc., you're going to need people to crew them, and one of the easier ways of doing that would be to scrap your much older and much less capable cruisers, i.e. the early C-class, and simply move their crews to form the core of a crew on a newer, larger vessel, which in turn means that you have a fairly decent, high-quality, brand-new cruiser straight out of the starting block, as opposed to a completely green crew, which you may have had trouble recruiting. Now, in absolute terms, with the benefit of hindsight, you can say yes, probably actually, to be honest, retaining them at least as convoy escorts against merchant raiders and submarines and such might have actually been a good idea if they'd been stuck in reserve and then reactivated in 1939. But unfortunately, that's hindsight speaking, and the Royal Navy was thinking it would have a few more years to go, by which point it would have had an awful lot more modern cruisers, and it would have then not really needed them anyway. And a couple of people asked this, actually several people in the Lyon video asked this, why not have 2 forward super-firing turrets? And this applies to several designs, not necessarily just the Lyon. Now, depending on the class, it can have a number of different answers. On quite a few classes, it can simply be that having a pair of super-firing turrets forward obviously means that the super-firing turret has to be elevated at least a deck level higher, which means more weight on the because of the higher barbette, and it also means less stability because obviously you've got a weight mounted higher up in the ship, and therefore they just don't want that, and they prefer to have the turret elsewhere. With the Lyon class, this is perhaps slightly less of a reason that you could give, because as you can see, the turret is mounted slightly higher than the main deck anyway, so they're incurring much of that weight penalty just by having the first turret forward regardless. A second and far more common reason is to do with overall weight distribution across the ship, because you can see you've got kind of the midpoint of the ship, and you can tell where most of the boiler spaces are due to where the funnels are, so you can see that a lot of the machinery is forward of that centre point of the ship. You've also got the bridge structure, which usually includes a conning tower as well, and so all of this is weight that is forward of the theoretical centre of gravity. If you're just taking a purely sort of division at the midpoint down the ship, and obviously the centre of gravity is going to shift forward the more weight you put forward, and if you put 2 turrets forward, then as well as the funnels and the superstructure and a lot of machinery, etc., then there's suddenly an awful lot of weight very far forward on the ship, which obviously will move the ship's centre of gravity further forward, which will in turn mean that the ship will have a tendency to trim with a nose down position, which is pretty bad for seakeeping and generally having a relatively comfortable life. Whereas mounting that turret, or in the case of some of the older ships with wing turrets, further back, means that it's closer to, or in some cases even on, the ship's centre of gravity, which means that the ship is somewhat more balanced fore to aft. And in some cases, especially with a lot of earlier ships, it can also be to do with just the machinery itself, because you've got a relatively difficult job of balancing where your engines, your turbines usually, and your boilers are going to be, but they're going to take up a certain amount of space. The funnels have to come up from where the boilers are, and generally speaking, you need to have your superstructure forward of your funnels, unless you really, really like being smoked to death, at which point there may not actually be too much available real estate forward of the superstructure on which to place your gun turrets. Now, obviously, if you have less machinery, you can move the funnels somewhat back relative to the overall length of the ship, and thus the superstructure comes back and that frees up more space. Or you can use smaller turrets, like, say, twins, which use up less footprint, and therefore you can maybe fit a couple of them forward. or you can build your ship wider proportionally, which will allow you to spread your machinery out horizontally instead of linearly, which again allows you to drop your funnels and superstructure back somewhat. Although the disadvantage of that is if you then widen your ship and you make the length to breadth ratio smaller, you then need more power to get it up to a given speed, so it ends up being a bit of a vicious cycle in that respect. And of course there is also issues of protection, because if you are obviously armouring your citadel of your ship, if you have 2 turrets forward, then your citadel has to extend to cover those 2 turrets, whereas if you have an amidships Q turret, well, that's sitting over your machinery anyway, and you're going to have to armour that machinery space anyway, so you're actually saving fractionally on the amount of length along the ship that you're going to have to armour, albeit that you are probably going to be spreading your machinery out slightly by having an amidships turret, so the savings aren't quite as much as you might imagine. So there are a variety of reasons for this, and so it depends on the class what balance of those reasons is applicable. In the Leon's case, I think it's primarily just the fact that the quad turret was so large, as you can probably see from there, there just physically wasn't enough room to fit another quad turret on there before the ship's hull narrowed too much for it to be viable. Craig Hagenbruch asks, if some of the Royal Navy destroyers that were equipped with mines had been ordered to engage German destroyers in combat, would they have dumped all of their mines in order to get combat ready? Most definitely. Most of the mine-laying destroyers off of Norway were I-class or H-class units, although there were a couple from other nearby related classes as well, but generally they were all following the Royal Navy's interwar destroyer pattern for the 20s and most of the 30s, which was 4 single guns, 2 fore, 2 aft, and a couple of torpedo launchers. Now, to give you some idea of just how many mines they were carrying, the ones that had been assigned to mine-laying duty had had 2 of their main guns, i.e. half their main gun armament, and all of their torpedo tubes removed in order to compensate for the weight of the mines. So that's an awful lot of unprotected explosive on deck. So yes, if you're ordered into combat with German destroyers, get rid of those mines ASAP, because otherwise even a single German shell hit and you're going to disappear in a cataclysmic explosion, the likes of which are more properly reserved for capital ships, to be perfectly honest. There is also the minor issue of the fact you'd be trying to take on a German destroyer with no torpedoes and precisely 2 guns, but that is probably a secondary concern compared to dumping all of the mines. Pelham Express asks, what was the name of the half-sunk County-class cruiser towards the end of the Norwegian naval campaign, and how did it end up that way? So this was HMS Suffolk. She'd actually been on a bombardment mission blowing up various things around Stavanger before she was ordered to withdraw. But whilst she was in the process of withdrawing, her force, obviously including her, was ordered to sweep north to try and take out some enemy destroyers that had been reported. And in a wonderful display of early war RAF and Royal Navy cooperation, the RAF had promised to have fighter cover for Suffolk, because obviously at this point the Germans were able to operate aircraft into the Norwegian battle space, and most of them didn't show up, which meant that around about just after 8 o'clock in the morning, the Suffolk was subject to air attack. This went on for a while, off and on, until just after 10:30 in the morning, Suffolk was hit by a bomb. And if you want to give some idea of what the damage was, which is what your question is, well, I'll let HMS Suffolk's report speak for itself. So Suffolk was hit on the starboard side of the upper deck just forward of X turret by a dive bomber that released a bomb that was almost certainly a 1,100 pound or 500 kilogram bomb. And, well, It says, the bomb passed through the wardroom, the warrant officer's flag, the storerooms on the platform deck from starboard to port, and exploded in the inflammable store close to the bulkhead of the aft engine room. The effect of this explosion penetrated forward to the aft engine room and aft through X shell room to X cordite handling room. It is believed that a charge exploded in the cordite handling room, which penetrated the cordite hoist trunk and vented into X gun house. The empty cordite cage at the top of the hoist was broken, and the charge in the right traversing rammer caught fire. The roof of the turret was lifted, X-shell handling room and all oil fuel tanks in the vicinity of the explosion were holed. The bulkhead of the aft engine room was blown in, the engine room seriously damaged and flooded, and the force of the explosion vented up through the engine room exhaust trunks and up the hatches leading to the war room flat. A column of flame was seen to reach the height of the gaff on the main mast, destroying the ensign, and fires started in the wardroom flat, the warrant officer's flat, and the stores rooms underneath, and in the entrance to the officers' galleys. And the second wireless office and the aft gyro compass room were wrecked. The main wireless office was unable to transmit as a result of the blast. The aft 8-inch magazine had to be flooded, and about 1,500 tons of water entered the ship in about 20 minutes. A couple of hours later, she was down to 12 knots, having initially been dropped to 18 knots, and obviously the rear guns were out of action, and she was still under heavy air attack. Over time, progressive flooding meant her steering motors began to break down, and more water came on board. As the ship was reduced to steering by its propellers, it meant that the German bombers had an easier target, and a number of bombs landed pretty close by, including one that was basically within touching distance of the ship and caused a fair bit of damage. Again, to quote the damage report, by the late evening, the constant succession of near misses had completed the flooding of nearly all compartments aft of the forward engine room and up to main deck level, and the sea was lapping over the quarterdeck. Due to uneven flooding, the ship had also taken on a list of about 8 degrees to port at this time. The report goes on to say, this is by the point that they're much closer to home, it says, by this time with the list to port, the top of the quarterdeck bollards were almost awash. It was apparent that the ship had settled appreciably during the night, and she was still settling slowly. It was calculated there were at least 2,500 tons of water in the aft part of the ship. A decision was reached to beach the ship in Long Hope. The ship was successfully beached, after which water was pumped out, patches were applied, and with considerably less water in her hold than 1/4 of her entire displacement, Suffolk was able to limp back into port and was then repaired, which would turn out to be a very good thing for the Royal Navy, since of course Suffolk, along with her sister ship Norfolk, would a few months down the line be patrolling the Denmark Strait when Bismarck showed up, and it would be Suffolk's radar that would allow her to track the German battleship. Paul Ernst asks, why did the Nazi invasion of Norway occur simultaneously with the invasion of Denmark? Wouldn't it have been a major operational advantage to have Luftwaffe air cover in place before launching the Norway naval invasion force? In theory, yes, having air cover available for the invasion forces would have been a big benefit, but there are a few factors to bear in mind. One of which is that the entire operation was accelerated significantly due to various reasons, but the Altmark incident is usually highlighted as one of the big ones, and so any scheduling that the Germans might have originally had would of course be significantly compressed. Another is the fact that the naval invasion forces were ideally supposed to arrive by surprise, and whilst it can be, especially in 1940, relatively possible to hide a naval force, which has to be physically seen from a fairly short distance, hiding aircraft, which obviously fly much higher, is a lot more difficult. And both with the speed of aircraft and with the speed of communications, having aircraft circling somewhere over Denmark kind of on call for something isn't going to work very well, and to be honest also probably would be spotted by somebody, and having them on the landing airfields just waiting to rev up and go, again, far too much time lag to actually be of any particular use in terms of direct air support, because it would take them, for most of the forces at likely interception points, an aircraft from the moment that word was received, and not counting for any communications lag at that point, would take maybe at if it was really quick, 5 to 10 minutes to get into the air, if you're really lucky, sort of almost idling with engines on the end of the runway. And then it's going to take you at least half an hour to an hour at best, assuming the interception's fairly south, in order to get to the battle itself. And if you're being intercepted by destroyers or battle cruisers, if an aircraft shows up an hour and 15, hour and a half after the attack's begun, the best you can do is avenge your sunken forces. So there's that element to it. And also, occupying Denmark as a strategic move doesn't really buy Germany anything. So if you did invade Denmark first, everybody's going to be asking why. Considering you have Germany going into the invasion had a non-aggression pact with Denmark, enemy forces weren't going to be sailing into the Baltic, so the only plausible reason for invading Denmark would be to use it as a staging post to support an invasion of Norway. And once you do that, you are basically signposting, hey guys, we're going to invade Norway, better not do anything to stop us. At which point, whatever level of air cover you can realistically bring to your invasion fleet on a rolling basis is probably going to not help anywhere near as much as having large amounts of enemy ships, mines, and carrier-borne strike aircraft going after your ships is going to hurt. Because the thing you've got to remember is, yes, whilst anti-aircraft firepower and guidance systems were nowhere near as advanced as they'd get to be later in the war, there was also the fact that air striking power against ships was also nowhere near as advanced, practiced, or as equipped with as nasty weaponry as it would be later in the war. Now, fair enough, we have talked in the last question about HMS Suffolk and the rather nasty hit that it took, so air power certainly could do a lot of damage, and there were ships lost to aircraft on both sides. But, as I said, if the interceptions are happening off the sort of the middle section of Norway or heading towards the Narvik area, the amount of aircraft the Luftwaffe could realistically put up as strike-loaded aircraft ready to go and hit Allied warships, compared to the number of warships and potential carrier fighter support, such as it was, that might be brought in against them, it's not going to be quite enough. Now, obviously, over the course of a campaign, then the amount of damage, etc., that you can cause is a much different matter, but in the immediate, you probably don't want to be risking your ships at all. As I said, people not knowing that your ships are there and therefore getting there completely unmolested is a far, far, far better scenario than we have air cover, but that air cover also means the chances of the Royal Navy showing up on the horizon are massively increased. Bradley asks, was building cruisers for raiding worth it? They all seem to be doomed to be caught if you're a weaker power, and if you're stronger, just blockade the enemy. I think the answer is one of these things where it varies, and to a certain extent, I think possibly the idea of the raiding cruiser in the late 19th and early 20th centuries certainly took a few wrong lessons from the period where these things were mainly the sort of the linchpin of a lot of naval strategy in the various Napoleonic wars and the wars with France and Spain and everybody else that immediately preceded them, because I think they focused too much on the specifics of a raiding cruiser, or in the Age of Sail a raiding frigate, which would have been called a cruiser anyway because it did cruising, but no, regardless, and the overall strategic situation. Now, the reason I say that is broadly speaking, you're actually right. If you're a very much weaker power, your raiding ships will be mopped up in relatively short order, and if you're a significantly stronger power, you can just blockade. There is, however, a little bit of a sweet spot for the raiding ship, which sits in between them, and there's also a slight case for the stronger power as well. Now, for the stronger power, if your enemy is a force which you can comfortably beat in battle, but is going to cause excessive expense to actually fully blockade, then having fast raiding cruisers is probably a good idea, because it's actually, ironically enough, at that point easier to hunt down enemy merchant ships at sea than it is to try and blockade massive amounts of coastline. Although you probably will still want to do critical point blockade as well, and your cruisers are going to be multi-purpose vessels, i.e. they're not just purely built around commerce raiding, they will have fleet uses as well. And you can see this in, say, something like the War of 1812. Now, fair enough, the Royal Navy was somewhat distracted with fighting Napoleonic France at the same time. However, regardless of that, the United States in the War of 1812, even though it was limited to the east coast and parts of the southern coast at that point, was still far, far, far too large to practically blockade every single possible location a blockade runner might go. And so in that case, the Royal Navy's frigate force actually went out and captured quite a lot of American merchant ships at sea, and this was a significant part of the Royal Navy's tactics and strategy, as it had been in the previous conflicts, which we'll come to in a minute. And it actually did have a very, very negative effect on the American economy. America was basically flat broke by 1814, especially since its economy at that point had been largely mercantile based. So there is a case for the larger power using a raiding cruiser type force to take out an enemy's merchant marine if actually blockading their coastline is going to be too much like hard work. But in the more general terms, if you are the overall weaker power, I think where this mistake that I alluded to earlier comes in is that merchant raiding with cruisers or frigates that are doing cruising missions was a huge part of the Age of Sail, especially the Napoleonic War period, but going all the way back to the time of Francis Drake. But outside of a very few occurrences, this came into being in an environment where, whilst there would be a stronger side and there would be a weaker side, the actual overall balance of power was not massively divergent. So when you look at the sort of the classic period for the raiding frigate, which would be the various wars with first Royal France and then Republican France, which obviously became Napoleonic France, you see that although the Royal Navy generally held a degree of supremacy over the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, the overall balance of power was not so marked that the Royal Navy was completely superior. The Royal Navy could lose battles with the French Navy, full-on fleet battles. The French had enough ships, they had enough firepower, and at least until the Republican movement in France beheaded most of their competent officers, they definitely had the leadership as well. And that meant that the Royal Navy could not exert its full force against enemy merchant raiders. So it had to resort to convoys, it had to resort to its own merchant raiding frigates, and it had to resort to frigates also trying to actively hunt down individual enemy merchant raiding vessels. Now, when you fast forward to something like, say, the American Civil War, when you have Confederate merchant raiders, or the First or Second World Wars, where you obviously have Germany mainly trying to do the merchant raiding thing, the key difference there is that whilst they are weaker powers, they are so much substantially weaker powers naval-wise that the enemy isn't forced to keep their entirety of force worried about losing a direct naval confrontation with the other side. The closest you probably come is World War One, where even though on paper and probably in practice the Royal Navy was never at any particular risk of flat out losing a battle with the High Seas Fleet, although in 1914 the chances were closer than pretty much at any other time, even then the Royal Navy could afford to detach battle cruisers, armoured cruisers, light armoured cruisers as they were being called, and protected cruisers in huge amounts across the world to hunt down German merchant raiders. And that is basically the problem. If the enemy can focus a significantly large chunk of their forces on you, your merchant raiding is not going to work. Whereas if you are, say, big enough and scary enough that A, you're going to have a lot more merchant raiders, and B, your opponent can't afford to dispatch a huge chunk of forces after them, then your raiding cruisers will be practical. But not generally. And I think this is basically what it comes down to, is that they have a niche when the enemy force is weaker, but not massively so. If you are massively weaker, then, as you say, it's not really worth it, because at best all you're going to do is irritate the other side for a little bit until they swat all your expensively built cruisers. Cypher asks, would ships ever fire a mixture of armor-piercing and high explosive from their main guns, or was it uniform loading? In almost every case, it would be uniform loading, and there's two very good reasons for this. One is that if you're going to engage a target, you're going to choose the most suitable shell type for that engagement, and if you've chosen the most suitable shell type, why would you fire the lesser suitable shell type? But secondly is the fact that whilst an AP shell and an HE shell would obviously have the same caliber, being fired from the same gun, they are in fact very different ballistically. An HE shell and an AP shell for the same gun will actually usually weigh somewhat different, and they will also have different aerodynamics. An AP shell will have a very narrow pointed cap. HE shells, because they don't have that armor piercing cap, tend to be a little bit blunter nosed, and therefore between those two factors the ballistics of the two shells are actually quite different. You would have to set your elevation and such differently for each shell. So technically, if you really wanted to get complicated and you had a 2-gun or 3-gun turret or whatever, as can be seen here, you could adjust the angle of your guns to different elevations to account for the different shell types. But as I said, one, you're either shooting one or the other. You don't really want to shoot both at the same time, and two, that's just an unnecessary degree of additional complexity. So yeah, in practically every circumstance that wasn't involving some kind of accident, you would fire a uniform load from the guns for a given salvo. Chipster8253 asks, or he says, greetings from the other side of the pond. I grew up on Long Island, the long fish-shaped bit that sticks out of the Atlantic from New York State, which is often considered to be part of New York City, but isn't. I've heard many stories about attempts by German U-boats to land spies and guerrilla warfare-saboteur personnel on both Long Island and elsewhere along the American coast during the Second World War. Is this true? And if so, can you expand a bit on the places, incidents, and results thereof? There were, in fact, several landings of German agents in the United States conducted by U-boats, one of which was on Long Island. This formed two main operations. There was Operation Pistorius back in 1942, and, well, due to its failure later on, there was only one other operation, Operation Elster, in 1944. So Pistorius dropped men off of Long Island by one U-boat, and Florida in another U-boat. Elster dropped a couple of people off in Maine. Now, as far as their missions go, the objective of Pistorius was to sabotage American defense infrastructure and sow fear and panic amongst the American populace. The Operation Elster in 1944 was less about sabotage, more about intel gathering. But, well, the latter one, the operatives were captured by the FBI in and of themselves fairly quickly. The first one, however, there was knowledge that the operation had been undertaken, largely because a rather lucky member of the US Coast Guard managed to spot the Germans who landed on Long Island, but by the time anybody listened to him and patrols came out to find them, all they found was, well, the equipment they were going to use for sabotage, which was just as well, but the actual agents had gone off elsewhere. Now, as with so many German intel operations, and given who was in charge of the one does sometimes have to question whether or not this was deliberate or not. But the head of that particular operation, for a Nazi spy, had the somewhat difficult character flaw of hating the Nazis. Yeah, so instead of going on with his mission, albeit that it would have been somewhat difficult given that a lot of his explosives and such were obviously confiscated by the Coast Guard and they weren't exactly going to go back for them, he then persuaded one of the other agents to join him in almost immediately reporting himself to the FBI. The FBI didn't believe the random person phoning up claiming to be a Nazi spy because all 8 agents in this first operation had actually been selected specifically because they had worked and lived in America previously and therefore would be able to speak English and could basically pass as sort of German-American immigrants, as opposed to someone who'd learned about America purely from overseas, which especially obviously back in those days would have been something that would have thrown up a lot of cultural clashes and other issues like that. But anyway, so having failed to convince the FBI by phone that he was in fact a German agent, the head of the German sabotage team walked into the FBI headquarters and said, "I'm a German agent." And even then, it took a little bit of a time to convince the FBI that he was in fact a German agent, despite the fact that the president had ordered a massive manhunt for German agents. Yeah, make of that what you will. But in the end, they were all rounded up. Now, the main difference between this first operation in 42, apart from the fact it was 4 times as large, and the latter operation in 44, was that by 1944 it was fairly clear that America was winning the war and everyone had calmed down a bit. So the agents that were captured on the coast of Maine in 44 were given imprisonment sentences, whereas in 42, when everyone was in a big panic, the 8 German agents of Pistorius were put on military trial, and they were actually all sentenced to death, including, believe it or not, the 2 who turned the whole thing in. And it took a special intervention to get those 2 individual sentences commuted to life imprisonment and 30 years respectively, and then they were both released shortly after the war and deported. So yes, there were definitely German spies on Long Island. Not that it was particularly successful for all that long, but as said, given that Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, definitely did have certain Allied sympathies, the choice of mission leader being someone who actively hated the Nazis and would do absolutely everything they possibly could to try and get rid of any chance of that mission's chances of success, it could be complete and utter coincidence. It may also not be, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if it wasn't. Now, that isn't to say there weren't other German spy rings in America. There were, but as far as I'm aware, those are the 2 main cases of submarine-landed secret agents, as opposed to, shall we say, spies recruited and or placed in the US by more conventional means. Matt Kidd asks, Father Joseph O'Callaghan apparently refused the Navy Cross for his actions aboard the Franklin before he was subsequently awarded the Medal of Honor. It seems like a strange thing for him to do, so what's the deal? It's not like the Navy Cross isn't a very substantial honor. I can't find anything specific about why he refused the Navy Cross, albeit that I do have his book about his experiences on the Franklin on order, so maybe there's something in there that might illuminate the situation further. But short of that, I don't think it was a refusal because he didn't feel that the Navy Cross was a substantial enough honour, and whilst this is definitely going off into the realms of human psychology rather than naval history, which, shall we say, is not a field I'm necessarily qualified in, but based on my personal observations of a lot of people who do get these kinds of awards in general, it may, and I stress the word may, well be that in his particular case he may have felt that he didn't particularly deserve it on the grounds that, and this isn't saying he didn't, not at all, he definitely did deserve reward and recognition for what he did, but I think maybe from his perspective he may have looked at it from possibly one of 2 angles. Either looking at it from the vast number of casualties that occurred and possibly thinking maybe I could have saved more. Or two, he could have looked at it and just gone, well, and this is an attitude I have read about or seen in quite a number of people who've got gallantry awards, of I did what had to be done. I didn't do it for a medal, I didn't do it for a reward, I didn't do it to say, everyone look at me how brave I am. I just did it because I saw a situation and I had to do the best I could to stop that situation from getting worse. At which point, why do I deserve recognition and the people who came out of it much worse not get recognition? Because after all, most of the time, if it's not a posthumous award, you will be standing there and a lot of other people won't be. Now, as I say, I don't know. Chaplain O'Callaghan died long before I was born, so I've never never have had a chance to speak to him and gauge his kind of personality, but I suspect that may be part of it. And I can understand it to a certain degree. It is one of these strange things, I think, of when you are an external viewer of an action that many people would class as heroic, it's very easy to say this person, whoever they happen to be, deserves reward and recognition because of what they did. But very often you will find that the person themselves, or if you as an individual have ever been in a situation where you've done something and everyone afterwards is going, oh, look, that was fantastic, this is great, like, you're a really good person for doing this. Quite often you might find yourself in a situation going, well, no, I did what had to be done. There isn't... I don't deserve any particular reward or recognition, and really the people who do, if anyone does, are the people who aren't here to receive it. But, say, if someone has his book, maybe has already read it and can, maybe if it provides further illumination, then let us know in the comments below. Or maybe if anybody either knows more about the subject, or, and I know this is something of a long shot, but perhaps either knows someone who spoke to him or about it, or has even potentially even been lucky enough to speak to him about it themselves, or perhaps speak to other people who knew him, again, please sound off in the comments, because as I say, naval history, very much I will talk to you all day about. Human psychology, a little bit of a minefield. James Sean Moore asks, steamship lines painted stripes on their funnels for identification. I believe you once said that the British Navy did the same. Did this practice continue in other navies, and why did it die out? As the only band I've seen on warships have been the ones they have on their funnels as black bands to hide the soot. This grew out of a need for visual identification quickly of ships in battle. So it had actually a very brief history in the Royal Navy. You see, prior to around about 1900-ish, back when everybody was running around in their wonderful peacetime colour schemes, the simple fact of the matter was that there were enough design differences between different navies that when you combined that with their own distinct colour schemes, the chances of mistaking one for another were not particularly great. Also, to be perfectly honest, at the kind of ranges that they were fighting at in those periods, something like a very large flag would do perfectly well. But in the early 1900s, you had this dual occurrence of both gun ranges getting much longer, so ships being now much further away in battle, thus very fine details and things like flags might be much less distinct, and also the fact that the various multicoloured peacetime camouflage schemes were beginning, or not camouflage schemes, just paint schemes were beginning to go away, and a more uniform overall grey was being adopted. And this meant that all of a sudden, especially with a massive increase in, relatively speaking, standardized designs, it was going to suddenly look like it was going to be very hard to distinguish enemy ships one from another. Now, a reasonably well-informed person can probably look at a photo of a British pre-dreadnought, like say this one, and a German pre-dreadnought of roughly the same period and spot some key differences close up. But when you take some, like say the Italian, Austro-Hungarian, British, German, and not so much the Russian ones, but yeah, if you take those three, Italian, German, and British, and you take, say, their second or third to last pre-dreadnought classes and put very small silhouettes relatively far away, all of a sudden, working out exactly who is who can become much more difficult. The reason I exclude the Russians is because, like the French, they really like the tumble home, which is a very obvious thing to spot. Tumble home and high sides. So that's much easier to spot. But then again, if you're, and bearing in mind before the Triple Entente this was entirely possible, if you're fighting one but not the other, or possibly fighting alongside one against the other, you want to be able to distinguish who's who very quickly, and that's just in normal spotting conditions, let alone heat of battle, gun smoke, fog of war, literally shell splashes, etc., where you might only have brief glimpses of things. So having something that's quite high, quite easily visible, and quite obvious, like various coloured bands on a funnel, was a very easy way of identifying ships. Now, the problem was that this worked fine in theory right up until someone pointed out that if we can identify them, then so can the enemy, and that gives away information to the enemy we might not necessarily want them to have, and changing them frequently enough that the enemy won't understand what's going on is just going to confuse everyone in our own fleet equally so. And so round about the start of World War One, the funnel bands disappear. But those measures and similar do appear in other navies at different points. So if you look at a lot of pictures of the 1930s Japanese Navy, you'll notice that quite a number of their destroyers and cruisers have various bands on their funnels, although this wasn't to identify very particular specific ships. It was more a way of saying, one, we're Japanese, and two, it was a way of dividing up various squadrons and ships in various positions within certain squadrons, or sentai as they called them. And so, as I say, this method and other similar easy spot visual identification methods did crop up at various points in different navies over time, but you generally tended to find that, weirdly enough, they'd be implemented in peacetime because it made things very easy to spot and tell apart. And then as soon as wartime came along, almost universally everyone went, but we don't want the enemy figuring out this information and taking them all away again, which kind of made the whole thing pointless, except to naval historians who really like them, because it means that outside of wartime photos it makes it much, much easier to work out who is who. Robert Henry Ilston asks, you've talked about the canal limit the Panama Canal placed on US warship design. During World War II, was there ever any discussion in the US to widen the canal if the war continued to free up designers, or would the US simply build bigger ships if necessary and sail around the canal with the understanding that it would strain their logistics? The answer, in short, is yes. And to be more accurate, both. Now, that might not sound too helpful, but when it came to the Panama Canal, up until the Iowa and Essex classes, respectively, in terms of capital ships, they were built specifically with the idea of going through the Panama Canal in mind, even if this involved certain design compromises for things like the Iowa class's hydrodynamic profile. But beyond that, and you've got to remember the Midway and Montana classes were being designed right at the start of the 1940s, these ships were designed with beams well above that would fit in the Panama Canal as it existed at that time. So there was discussion, actually as far back as the South Dakota class, as to whether or not to build to the restrictions of the Panama Canal or to make things wider. And this was a discussion that had actually happened on and off even further back than then, but from what I can tell, around about the time of the South Dakota class was when the discussion really started to pick up and didn't really go away. And at around about shortly thereafter, there were then sort of firmed up plans to actually widen the Panama Canal locks, because this is the thing, the canal overall is not a uniform width, it's the specific canal locks that are the problem. There are other areas that are much, much wider. So yes, there was discussion and plans, and eventually those plans did obviously go through, to widen the Panama Canal, and this is why the Midways and the Montanas were designed with a beam that was significantly greater than the existing locks, because they knew, as far as anyone can know when it comes to naval procurement programs, that the Panama Canal locks were going to be widened. But there was also a slightly lesser known part of history, which was that a lot of the bulges and such that were constructed for the refits of the standard class battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, quite a number of those, like say USS California, West Virginia, the additional bulges that were added rendered the ships too wide to get through the Panama Canal, period. And obviously those ships were in service long before the Midways, and obviously infinitely before the Montanas. And in those cases, it was just accepted that we need these extra protective measures, and so we're just going to accept the fact that they can't go through the Panama Canal. And we're effectively going to strand them in the Pacific, realistically, until peacetime, which meant they could just sail all the way around the world. And since we hit almost exactly an hour with that, John Graubard asks, what would have happened if the Japanese had decided to send a massive fleet to Guadalcanal in November 1942? Now, that's a very interesting choice of timing, and I refuse to believe that was accidental, because it actually makes a very interesting scenario. Because you see, you'd think that in late 42, early 43, it would be all about the carriers, and generally you might well be right. But look at exactly when this is. November 42, on the US side, what did they have? Lexington, sunk. Yorktown, sunk. Hornet, sunk. Wasp, sunk. Ranger, not in the Pacific. Enterprise, badly damaged. Saratoga, just about in service. That's literally it. This is the period where you have USS Robin, aka HMS Victorious, because that is literally all that the US has in terms of carrier hulls. The Japanese aren't in much better state because, well, what have you got? Hosho, don't make me laugh. Akagi, sunk. Kaga, sunk. Rujo, sunk. Soryu, sunk. Hiryu, sunk. Shokaku, damaged. Zuikaku, in service. Zuiho, damaged. Shoho, sunk. Now, fair enough, you do have Junyo and Hio, but they're a little bit slow. So, practically speaking, you have Zuikaku and maybe these other two slightly smaller, slightly slower carriers, and that's it outside of the odd random converted escort ship, which again, small air group, slow speed. So actually it's not going to be a carrier fight, most likely. Henderson Field is up and running, albeit the Japanese are doing their best to bombard it. So to be honest, Henderson Field is probably going to provide the majority of aircraft strike. But if the Japanese are going all out to Guadalcanal, they're probably going to bring in Junyo, Hio, probably even the escort carriers, even if the escort carriers are following up with the invasion forces rather than the fast task force. And to be honest, those two might be with the invasion forces as well. So pretty much the air cover for the main fleet is going to have to be provided by Zuikaku. And that in turn means that the Allies are going to have to throw everything into the basket as well. And I say Allies because you would have to bring Victorious with you. So it would be Saratoga and Victorious versus plus Henderson Field versus Zuikaku plus distant support from a motley collection of slower Japanese escort and other converted carriers, which would be interesting in and of itself, certainly, but neither side there really possessing the air striking firepower to break through and destroy a large enemy fleet commitment. Now, for the Japanese, they still have most of the Gongo class, Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, the Fusos and Iseis if they really want to go all the way. At this point, they even still have Mutsu, because Mutsu reallocated itself to the seabed in 1943, not 42. And, well, in actual fact, that's quite a scary prospect, because when you look at the end of 1942, November kind of specifically, what does the US actually have? Well, it's got Arkansas, but in terms of well, there's New York and Texas, I guess. They don't have Nevada. Nevada's not ready. Oklahoma is still gone, and obviously is permanently gone. You could bring Pennsylvania, but Arizona is obviously gone. You can bring New Mexico and Mississippi, but not Idaho because it's having its guns replaced. Tennessee's just gone into refit, and California's in the middle of effectively a rebuild. Colorado and Maryland are available, but West Virginia is still being rebuilt. North Carolina and Washington are both obviously available, although South Dakota, the next one along, for equally obvious reasons, isn't. It's under repair following the fight with Kirishima. Indiana's on its way, but probably isn't going to get there in time. Massachusetts is over quite happily taking pot shots at Jean Bart. And Alabama is still undergoing her shakedown cruise on the East Coast. So in that respect, if you're going to match battleship for battleship based on what's available, you've got, if the Japanese are putting everything in theory, you've got Yamato and Musashi facing off against the two North Carolinas. And whilst the North Carolinas are nice ships, that's not a fight I'm going to be putting money on their behalf, certainly. The Colorados, the two Colorados that are available are going to face off against the Nagatos, which actually is reasonably enough a fair fight. In fact, I'd probably give us an advantage to the Colorados there, to be perfectly honest. But then you have you have two battle cruisers, because you don't have Hiei and Kirishima anymore, but you've got Kongo and Haruna, and you've got the Fusos and the Isseis. So you've got 6 ships armed with 14-inch guns, 4 battleships, 2 battle cruisers. And to match off against that, you have basically a loose collection of various standards, with New York, Texas, and Arkansas kind of there as your additional ships to help try and round up survivors. Now, obviously, those last 3 are going to be a bit slower than everybody else, but yeah, although on paper the US has a slight advantage, Yamato Musashi versus North Carolina and Washington. That's, yeah. It would be a very, very interesting fight, let's just put it that way. It's about as close as the Japanese are ever going to get to a quote-unquote fair fight in terms of a battle line. And as we said, the absolute air power present on either side, probably not going to be enough to make a significant dent one way or the other, assuming that both sides play things relatively smart, because if the Japanese bring up this slow task force with their escort carriers and slower small fleet carriers, between them and Zuikaku, they definitely have a numbers advantage against Saratoga and Victorious - Robin. Henderson Field will go some way to mitigating that, but Henderson Field could be disrupted in various ways. So, yeah, if they'd gone in for a big old fight, the main thing would have been all those shallow waters and such, and whether or not one side or the other's destroyers and submarines could take major advantage of whittling down the other side. But it would be a huge gamble, a huge roll of the dice either way, and probably the exact reason why the Japanese didn't go for it. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Just a couple of small pieces of channel admin going forward. Firstly, to those of you who bought Thunderchild posters or the Fleet Aeron posters this week, those have all been dispatched. You should have seen the look on the local post office face when I turned up with 2 massive IKEA bags full of poster tubes. Oh, I don't think they like me very much anymore. But nevertheless, they're on their way. If anyone wants a proof of postage or anything, please just drop me a line. Separately, some of you may have heard of a company called Warlord Games. They manufacture a variety of different tabletop games. More specifically to those of us with naval interests, they manufacture a couple of game systems, pre-existing ones. There's Cruel Seas, which is mostly based around small craft, so torpedo boats, literally, S-boats, MTBs, MGBs, that kind of thing. About the biggest thing that shows up are things like armed trawlers and corvettes, that kind of thing. You might recognise some of their ships, as it was actually their line of ships that I acquired and painted to donate to the Western Approaches Command as a simulation of a convoy attack. They also do Black Sails, which is an Age of Sail Napoleonic War era tabletop game, and you've got the Royal French, Spanish, and American navies in that at the moment. Look out for those featuring in a future video when I manage to get the third part of Nelson's life up and running, and that will feature quite a lot of these little ships as we reenact the Battle of Trafalgar in miniature. And the most recent one just released, Victory at Sea, and that is focused on World War II. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, future episodes on the naval campaigns of Guadalcanal will make use of these ships as well as maps to try and show what the heck is actually going on half the time. And for full disclosure, every miniature that I've just mentioned that I own has been bought and paid for by myself. I haven't received those as any kind of sponsorship or anything, but since they like my content, they have offered to make me an affiliate, which I've accepted. So if you happen to want to purchase any of these, then it would be nice if you click the affiliate link in the description down below, and that'll help the channel out a little bit, which would be quite nice. But other than that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video at some point.